Hello everybody. In this brief lecture, I'd like to identify some of the most important points that are coming from Chapter 4 from the IOM book on preventing mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders amongst young people, progress and possibilities. We're mostly going to focus on the developmental framework for prevention science. I'm going to organize this brief lecture into three parts. First, I'll discuss the key features of a developmental framework. Then we'll talk about the developmental perspective on risk and protective factors. And then we'll conclude with some ideas about the methodological implications we're just beginning to understand of this developmental perspective. So a developmental framework to prevention science has four key principles that we're going to keep in mind throughout this course. We're going to talk about age-related patterns of competence and disorder, the importance of considering multiple contexts, the concept of developmental tasks, and the interactions amongst biological, psychological, and social factors. When we discuss age-related patterns, what we're basically suggesting is that in order to develop a potentially effective preventative intervention, we need to have a shared idea within a particular culture of the developmental competencies that we anticipate that at one stage of life are going to be foundational for later competencies. And it's really important for us to also understand the age at which a disorder or an adverse outcome emerges, because as we've discussed, our preventative efforts need to begin prior to the onset of the adverse outcome. In general, it's also important to note that when we identify a disorder that has an earlier onset, we are usually identifying things that tend to be more impairing across the lifespan. Not always, but often. So the earlier the onset, the more complex our models might be. All of this is best understood when we consider an ecological model of functioning, such as articulated by Bronfenbrenner in 1979 and other pieces when he wrote about nested contexts, where, as we've talked about before, you have the individual in the center, and then in a series of concentric circles, things that impact the development of that individual have to do with the context around the person. So it could be the family, and then the neighborhood, the community, schools, and then the broader culture. So prevention efforts often need to happen across multiple contexts in order to have a meaningful effect. Therefore, our research on prevention efforts also needs to be conducted in multiple contexts. And we'll talk more in this course on some of the challenges of studying a prevention intervention in a school setting or another public place where we don't necessarily have all the controls we might have within a laboratory. A third really important feature of a developmental framework is this idea of developmental tasks. These are kind of the basis for those developmental competencies I mentioned before. So within a culture, we usually have generated a specific set of expectations for specific behaviors in specific settings or contexts. And the specificity of these models are particularly important in designing preventative interventions. We know that accomplishing developmental tasks is going to happen at different rates within a culture, and that the complexities of developmental tasks are going to change across development and are going to be impacted by the individual's interactions across multiple contexts. So while some developmental tasks, such as learning how to control your motor movements, become a foundation for later tasks, such as learning how to walk, to take an idea from infancy, there is a cumulative effect often on accomplishing developmental tasks at one stage of development, having a pretty important impact on whether or not the individual can function well later on in life. And some developmental tasks have a broader reach or a broader impact than others. But if an individual has not mastered an age-expected developmental competency, we often need to help that individual master that foundational skill before we can move forward. And then a fourth key factor of the developmental framework is that functioning never happens in a vacuum. In fact, there's going to be interactions across domains, biological, social, psychological, as well as across these nested contexts. And understanding the various pathways to a disorder or to wellness or not having the disorder will help us identify these leverage points that we can rely upon for our prevention efforts. So we need to understand this complex landscape around a particular adverse outcome. We need to understand the factors that increase the probability of that adverse outcome, as well as the factors that decrease the probability for that adverse outcome. And that's where we get our leverage points for prevention. If you are looking for an example of these key features of a developmental framework in action, take a look at pages 74 to 81 of chapter 4, which is in your readings. The authors go through step by step how mental health promotion is an example of applying this developmental framework. And in fact, table 4-1, it does a nice job of giving us examples of age-related patterns, multiple contexts, and developmental tasks. The interactions amongst those domains of functioning are implied, but you can also generate some ideas as you look at those tables. Moving on now to the developmental perspective on risk and protective factors, there's a few things I'd like for you to keep in mind. First is that in order to develop an effective prevention program, we do need to understand the developmental, so sort of like within the person, and the contextual factors, things that happen outside the person. In addition, we have to understand which of these factors are malleable or can be changed, and which ones are fixed and cannot be changed. Because in our interventions, we are probably going to focus most of our efforts on either malleable factors or on factors that influence malleable factors. Let's take a look then at the important characteristics of risk factors. They occur at multiple levels, as you might expect from the ecological model, within the person or biological, as well as at various levels of cultural context. Risk factors can be variable, where an individual changes in their risk factor status over time, or they may be fixed, such that they don't change over time, and in that way are not likely to be affected by an intervention, such as a person's ethnicity. Variable markers are those risk factors that either cannot be changed by an intervention or have not been shown to impact an outcome. So even if the intervention improves them, they still don't result in the actual outcome getting any better. So understanding the association between risk factors and outcomes is an important part of the research, and sometimes a promising risk factor becomes a variable marker because it doesn't have the kind of impact that we've been looking for. Now, as we turn our attention to protective factors, we recognize that there are at least two ways that we can consider how a protective factor, something that decreases the probability of an adverse outcome, can actually work. First, there's the direct impact, such that by increasing access to a protective factor, you see an associated decrease in an adverse outcome. That's where the protective factor is working directly through a causal or mechanistic link, has a mediating relationship with the outcome. There are also more complex models where protective factors have an interactive impact. In other words, they operate through or they operate with other factors, either risk factors or other protective factors, to decrease the actual impact of risk factors on outcome. So protective factors can act directly or in interaction, and our efforts to build in promotive or protective factors to our interventions are going to need to take into account the complexity of these pathways. So risks and protective factors are discussed quite clearly and in I think a really good way in chapter 4 in the table that goes through all of the developmental examples of preventative interventions and also describes how the risks and preventative factors have been leveraged. So I encourage you to take a look at table 4.2 for the summary of findings from the task force if you need more concrete examples. I'd also like for you to keep in mind a few more things about these complex things we call risk and protective factors. First, they can have both a specific impact and a general one. So a risk or a protective factor might only work for a specific disorder, or it could be something that impacts a broader array of outcomes. In general, risks and protective factors are negatively correlated with each other. They're often associated in negative directions. They also tend to be cumulative in the impact, so that multiple factors usually add up to a different strength of impact on the outcome. And as I've mentioned previously, risks and protective factors occur across contexts, and they may do so in different ways. The way something operates within a family could be very different than the way it operates within a school, for example. Risks and protective factors can influence each other in many dynamic and complex ways across these levels of analysis. So it's important to keep in mind that we are not talking about a one-to-one correspondence sort of model where if you just increased a protective factor, you'd automatically see a decrease in an adverse outcome. These relationships often require a path analysis way of looking at things, where you think about if this is increased, how does that impact this other variable, which impacts this other variable, which then in this context has this impact on the outcome. So these additive effects can occur. Protective factors can also have what we would describe as moderating effects. That means that they influence the relationship between risk factors and outcomes. They don't operate directly on the outcome. They operate by impacting how the risks are associated with the outcomes. Or protective factors can have mediating effects, and this is where the protective factor actually accounts for a decrease in the probability of an adverse outcome. This has to do more with identifying the causal mechanisms underlying a disorder and seeing a direct relationship between a protective factor and the outcome. So as we consider the complexity of these models and all the different ways that risks and protective factors and outcomes are going to interact, we begin to see that we're going to need some pretty complex methods in order to understand these relationships and in order to test whether or not our interventions actually have any impact on changing these relationships. So already we can recognize that a developmental framework tells us we need strong developmental theories that really connect risk and protective factors with specific outcomes. And we need to test those theories in a variety of populations and in a variety of contexts. Simultaneously, as we are developing prevention programs, we need longitudinal designs with multiple follow-up points in order to see if and when our prevention effort has any impact on the outcome, but also we're going to want to measure the risks and protective factors along the way and understand how that relationship changes either in association with the delivery of the intervention or after the fact. So we'll be covering methodological implications a bit later in the curriculum, and there's quite a lot that we can talk about with that. So for today, I just want to direct your attention to deeply reading Chapter 4. I hope highlighting these main points has helped you see the things that will really be foundational for future lectures. And I just want to make two last comments. The first is kind of obvious. Strong prevention science really does rely on strong developmental research. We have to begin with theories and really strong theory testing, and we have to always think about complex interactions across contexts and across time. Secondly, in order for prevention science to really lead to meaningful change, we need to have ways as scientists to communicate effectively about our efforts so that the public understands the importance of the prevention and the reason why certain steps can be taken to decrease an adverse outcome or increase a positive outcome. We as scientists need to get really, really good at communicating complex information to the general public and to policymakers so that we can have support at multiple levels of our culture in order for these prevention strategies to actually be implemented in real life. So thank you for your time and attention, and we'll see you on Wednesday.